Welcome to Imran Star Video, or as we call it, ISVi, the collaborative lens on Vancouver, unfiltered, unscripted, and powered by community. We're not just a voice behind the microphone, we're a collective of creators, thinkers, storytellers, and city lovers coming together to spotlight the people, places, and energy that make Vancouver what it is. From coast mountain skylines to neon-lit backstreets, we're covering everything from downtown buzz to the untold stories shaping our scene. You'll find us exclusively on YouTube, no algorithms, no filters, just real talk. For behind the scenes, updates, and chaotic brilliance in real time, follow us on TikTok and Instagram. So hit subscribe, drop a comment, and help us grow from 100 to 10,000 subscribers and beyond, because this isn't just our platform, it's yours too. Turn it up, get into it, let's talk Vancouver. This is ISVi. Long before the city of Vancouver came into being, before the pavement, the skyline, or the name itself, there was land, living, breathing land. Land that was cared for, understood, and held sacred. The mountains, rivers, and shorelines that now frame Vancouver's identity are not simply backdrops for urban life, they are part of a much older continuous story, one that began with the Coast Salish peoples who have lived here for thousands of years. The lands now called Vancouver are the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These nations have lived on, with, and in relationship to this place since time immemorial. Their deep knowledge of the land, their oral histories, and their spiritual connections to this region are not just part of Vancouver's distant past, they are its foundation. While they recognize Vancouver as a world-class city, it is essential to understand that its story did not begin with settlers, railways, or colonial governments. It began with Indigenous stewardship, rich cultural traditions, and profound respect for the natural world. In recent years, there has been growing awareness around land acknowledgements and the importance of recognizing Indigenous presence. But to truly honor these roots requires more than a statement. It requires a deeper look at whose land we live on, what histories we've inherited, and how we move forward in a way that centers Indigenous sovereignty, voice, and justice. This journey begins by listening to the stories that were here long before concrete and glass. Stories etched into the cedar trees, whispered along the waters, and passed down through generations of Coast Salish people. This exploration will trace the Indigenous roots of Vancouver, from traditional lifeways and ecological wisdom to colonization and cultural resurgence. It is a chance to understand that before Vancouver, there was not absence, but abundance. And the truth is the first step toward meaningful reconciliation and a more honest future. The Coast Salish world, culture, territory, and lifeways. To truly understand Vancouver's foundation, we must first shift our focus not to what was built here, but to what was already thriving. Long before the name Vancouver was etched onto any map, this region was home to the Coast Salish peoples, whose cultures, governance systems, and spiritual relationships with the land had evolved over thousands of years. Their presence was not marginal, nomadic, or incidental. It was deeply rooted, highly organized, and intimately connected to the land and waters we now inhabit. The Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, among many Coast Salish peoples, belong to a broader cultural and linguistic family that stretches throughout the Salish Sea, encompassing parts of present-day British Columbia and Washington states. These communities developed distinct yet interconnected societies, rich in knowledge, protocol, and tradition. Their territories spanned coastal inlets, river mouths, mountain traits, and dense forests, with each landscape carrying its own significance, not as property, but as kin. Every island, mountain peak, and stream was part of a sacred web of relationships, deeply interwoven with the spiritual, social, and ecological lives of the people. Central to Coast Salish life was the concept of reciprocity, the belief that humans are not separate from the natural world, but part of it, with responsibilities to care for and live in balance with their environment. Seasonal movement, fishing practices, and food gathering were guided not by domination, but by deep ecological knowledge and respect. The Fraser River and Burrard Inlet were not only sources of sustenance, but sacred arteries of life, providing salmon, sturgeon, and shellfish in accordance with ceremonial cycles and traditional law. Cedar trees were carefully harvested for canoes, homes, and regalia, with prayers and offerings made in acknowledgement of their gift. Governance among Coast Salish peoples was structured through hereditary leadership, matrilineal lineage, and consensus-based decision-making, with community well-being and accountability to ancestors and future generations at the heart of social organization. Each nation had a complex oral tradition, which preserved laws, land rights, and ancestral teachings through storytelling, songs, and longhouse ceremonies. Far from being pre-literate, these traditions convey detailed histories, environmental wisdom, and sophisticated spiritual systems passed down with precision and care. Language, too, was a lifeline. The Coast Salish language family includes dialects such as Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, each rich in place-based knowledge and expressions that reflect a worldview of connection, humility, and respect. Efforts to reclaim or revitalize these languages today reflect the profound importance of voice, memory, and identity in the ongoing story of the Coast Salish world. This was not a scattered group of villages, it was a vibrant, thriving network of nations with structured diplomacy, vast trade routes, and ceremonial alliances. Their wealth was measured not only in material resources, but in generosity, knowledge, and spiritual integrity. Values reflected in traditions like the potluck, a ceremonial system of governance, reciprocity, and economic redistribution that was so powerful it was banned by colonial authorities. In every aspect of life, from fishing and weaving to teaching and storytelling, the Coast Salish worldview embodied a profound balance between human need and ecological responsibility. A balance that modern cities like Vancouver are only now beginning to seek through sustainability initiatives. Yet, what is often missing from these contemporary efforts is the recognition that the blueprint for balance already existed here, long before colonization, concrete, or climate crisis. To honor the Coast Salish world is not merely to acknowledge its existence, but to understand its depth, and to recognize that the wisdom embedded in its traditions offers not only insight into the past, but guidance for how we might live better in the present and future. Yet, while the Coast Salish world was built on harmony, stewardship, and cultural continuity, the arrival of European settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries disrupted that balance with devastating force. The transition from thriving nationhood to imposed invisibility did not happen by accident. It was the deliberate result of colonization, land theft, and systemic erasure. But what colonial governments could not extinguish was the resilience, resistance, and cultural brilliance of the Indigenous peoples who refused to disappear. The establishment of what we now call Vancouver, a name imposed by settlers, occurred without consent, consultation, or compensation. The city's foundation in 1886 marked the formalization of an occupying presence, built on unceded Indigenous land, meaning land that was never surrendered or legally transferred through treaties. Instead, entire communities were pushed off their territories through legal maneuvering, military force, and bureaucratic tactics disguised as progress. One of the most striking examples of this dispossession was the destruction of a vibrant Squamish village located in what is now Kitsilano. In the early 1900s, settlers and government officials forcibly removed families from their homes, burned buildings to the ground, and cleared the land to make way for urban expansion. This violent displacement did not just remove people from land, it attempted to sever cultural memory, spiritual connection, and intergenerational continuity. Similar patterns of erasure occurred throughout the Lower Mainland. With reserves created on marginal land, often disconnected from resources and stripped of autonomy. The imposition of the Indian Act, the residential school system, and the criminalization of cultural practices such as the potluck further deepened the wounds of colonization. Children were stolen from families and placed in institutions designed to erase their language, culture, and identities, often suffering physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in the process. Generations of Indigenous peoples carry the pain of these policies, passed down as both trauma and testimony. And yet, in the face of such brutality, the Coast Salish peoples survived. Their survival is not just about physical endurance, it is about cultural defiance, legal resistance, and spiritual resilience. Families held on to language in secret, smuggled songs and ceremonies through whispered memory, and reassembled broken communities into spaces of healing and resistance. Leaders took their cases to Canadian courts and the United Nations, demanding recognition of land rights and sovereignty. Elders continued to teach stories, protocols, and land-based knowledge despite institutional suppression. Artists, weavers, and carvers revived ancient techniques and infused them with new political meaning. This resilience is not passive, it is active, generational, and deeply intentional. Today, many Coast Salish communities continue to live with the legacies of colonization, overcrowded housing, contaminated water, underfunded schools, and persistent racism. But they also continue to rebuild, reassert, and reimagine what self-determination looks like in the 21st century. Their strength is not defined by victimhood, but by a refusal to be erased and a relentless commitment to ensuring their cultures, languages, and rights not only survive, but thrive. Colonization was violent, displacement was systematic, but Indigenous resurgence is unstoppable. The Coast Salish peoples are not relics of a forgotten past. They are leaders of an enduring present and architects of a sovereign, self-determined future. While the scars of colonization run deep, so too does the strength of Indigenous resurgence. And today, that resurgence is not just cultural, but spatial, legal, and unapologetically political. Across the territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the movement to reclaim land and revive traditional ways of being is not only growing, it is transforming the landscape, both physically and ideologically. In a city like Vancouver, built on unceded territory, the Land Back movement represents more than restitution. It is a bold reassertion of identity, sovereignty, and memory. One of the most powerful examples of this resurgence is the development project led by the Squamish Nation on their reclaimed ancestral land near the Burrard Street Bridge. Once a village violently dismantled by colonial authorities, this village is now the site of a visionary urban housing development, one that will create thousands of rental units, generate long-term economic power for the nation, and stand as a symbol of Indigenous-led innovation and self-determination. What makes this project revolutionary is not only its scale, but the fact that it was designed, financed, and approved outside the bounds of colonial municipal zoning laws, a reminder that real sovereignty means acting beyond imposed systems. But Land Back is not only about construction or real estate, it's also about restoring relationships to the land, to each other, and to ancestral knowledge systems that were never truly lost. Across the Lower Mainland, Coast Salish peoples are revitalizing languages, rebuilding longhouses, teaching youth land-based practices, and reclaiming ceremonial spaces that were once banned. Language nests, immersion schools, canoe journeys, and cultural camps are just educational programs. They are acts of resistance and reclamation, ensuring that future generations can walk in their identities with pride and fluency. Art and storytelling have also played a central role in this cultural resurgence. From massive public murals to museum exhibitions, Indigenous artists, weavers, and carvers are reshaping the city's visual landscape with stories once suppressed. The return of carved welcome figures, traditional name restorations, and public installations of Coast Salish symbology challenge the erasure that once defined Vancouver's urban development. These acts remind both Indigenous and non-Indigenous residents that this land was and remains sacred, storied, and loved. At the same time, political power is rising. Coast Salish leaders are asserting their place at decision-making tables, not as guests, not as rights holders, but as rights holders. They are negotiating government-to-government relationships, challenging corporate land deals, intervening in environmental reviews, and advocating for criminal justice through the lens of ancestral knowledge. The resurgence is both grassroots and institutional, driven by youth and elders alike, fueled by cultural pride and legal precedent, and grounded in the undeniable fact that Indigenous peoples have never stopped being here. Importantly, land back is not about exclusion, it is about responsibility. It invites settlers, newcomers, and governments to understand that justice requires the restoration of land, the elevation of Indigenous governance, and the disruption of colonial entitlement. It's not charity, it's truth in action. Reclaiming space is about more than physical land. It's about story. It's about correcting the narrative that Indigenous peoples are relics of the past and replacing it with the truth that is vibrant, active, and present. Vancouver's future, if it is to be just, must center these voices and honor the resurgence happening all around us. Land back is not only possible, it is already happening, and with it, a new story is being written, one led by those who have always belonged. Truth and reconciliation in practice, moving beyond acknowledgement. While land acknowledgements have become increasingly common in public events, classrooms, and government meetings, the question remains: what comes after the words? Recognition, though symbolically important, is only the first and often is the easiest step. True reconciliation requires more than acknowledgement. It demands action, accountability, and the willingness to give up power in service of justice. Vancouver, built entirely on the truth and reconciliation. Vancouver, built entirely on unceded Indigenous territory, must not only admit this fact, but act on it in ways that reshape its systems, institutions, and priorities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, which released its final report in 2015, laid out 94 calls to action, a roadmap to healing and structural change. These calls span education, justice, language revitalization, child welfare, and more. The progress on them has been uneven and, at times, symbolic rather than substantive. Reconciliation cannot be reduced to a gesture at the beginning of a meeting. It must be felt in the budget lines, hiring policies, curriculum content, and decision-making tables that define public life. In Vancouver and across British Columbia, this means centering Indigenous voices in governance, not as consultants, but as rights holders and decision makers. It means elevating Indigenous leadership in urban planning, environmental policy, and health services. Areas where colonial systems have long ignored or harmed Indigenous people. Municipal governments, universities, school boards, and cultural institutions must move beyond performative gestures and embed reconciliation into the DNA of their daily operations. Education plays a crucial role in this transformation. Far too long, school curricula ignored or distorted Indigenous histories, presenting Canada's colonial project as benign or benevolent. Today, educators must ensure that every child in Vancouver learns not only about residential schools and treaty rights, but also about the brilliance of Coast Salish governance, knowledge systems, and cultural survival. Indigenous knowledge must not be relegated to a sidebar. in history textbooks. It must be seen as vital to shaping our collective future. Equally, reconciliation requires the amplification of Indigenous languages, many of which were targeted for extinction through residential schools and forced assimilation. Supporting language revitalization efforts, though just acquiring through immersion programs, funding for elders as teachers, and integration of traditional place names is an act of cultural survival and reclamation. When a child learns to speak Coast Salish languages, they are not just acquiring vocabulary, they are restoring ancestral memory and reconnecting with land identity and legacy. Reconciliation is also economic. For generations, Indigenous communities were excluded from the wealth generated by the very lands they stewarded for millennia. Moving forward means creating pathways to Indigenous economic sovereignty, whether through the return of land, the creation of revenue sharing agreements, or prioritizing Indigenous-led business development. Projects like the Senaqua development are leading the way, but they must be the exception. But they must not be the exception. They must become part of a new normal. And most importantly, reconciliation is about truth-telling and listening to the stories that were silenced, and bearing witness without defensiveness, and about sitting with discomfort long enough to be changed by it. It is about understanding that harm was not just historical, it is ongoing, and that all healing can only begin when truth is fully faced. Reconciliation is not a checkbox, it is a lifelong process. It is a relationship, and relationships require work, trust, humility, and reciprocity. In a city like Vancouver, reconciliation must be visible, not just in ceremonies, but in its zonings, its parks, its libraries, its police reform, its transit planning, and its environmental policies. It must touch every institution and be led unapologetically by the peoples who have called this land home since time immemorial. Because in the end, acknowledgement is only meaningful when it's followed by a shift in power, resources, and truth. And Vancouver, if it wishes to truly live up to its promise, must be willing to do the hard work of reconciliation, not in name, but in practice. If the journey through Vancouver's Indigenous history teaches us anything, it is this: we cannot chart a just future without fully facing the truths of the past. The stories of the Coast Salish peoples are not ancient relics. They are living realities written into the rivers, mountains, and place names that shape this land. Their knowledge, languages, and stewardship have sustained this territory for thousands of years, long before colonization, and continue to guide its possibilities today. To honor this legacy means recognizing that Vancouver exists not in spite of Indigenous peoples, but because of them. And yet honoring is not enough. It must be paired with commitment to truth, to justice, and to transformation. That commitment means taking reconciliation out of the realm of symbolic gestures and rooting it in real, material change. It means supporting land-back initiatives, protecting Indigenous rights, funding Indigenous-led institutions, and listening when Indigenous communities tell us what they need, not what we think they should want. Honoring the past also means making space for Indigenous futurity, for joy, innovation, leadership, and cultural flourishing. It means shifting narratives from trauma alone to one of strength, beauty, and possibility. When we center Indigenous voices in urban planning, environmental justice, education, governance, and the arts, we begin to decolonize not just land, but imagination. Every person living on this land, whether settler, newcomer, or descendant of immigrants, has a role to play. That role begins with humility, grows with education and is sustained by action. We must ask ourselves, what kind of guests are we on this land? How are we honoring the treaties we benefit from, even when none were signed here? What legacy do we want to leave behind? Vancouver's future depends on how deeply it is willing to honor its past. Not just in words, but in systems, not just in art, but in policy, not just in ceremonies, but in land, leadership, and law. The Coast Salish peoples have offered the city more than its physical foundation. They offer a vision for how to live in balance, in relationship, and with respect. The responsibility now lies with all of us to uphold that vision, because reconciliation is not a destination, it's a direction. And the path forward is one we must walk together, led by those who have always known the way. And just like that, the city's pulse slows, but the story doesn't stop. You've been watching ISVi, Imran Star Video, where voices come together and the city speaks back. We're a crew, not a single face, a movement, not a moment, and every episode that's built with you, for you, by all of us. So subscribe on YouTube, follow us on TikTok and Instagram, drop a comment, leave a like, and tell us what your Vancouver sounds like. We're building this together, clip by clip, story by story, from 100 to 10,000 subscribers to wherever this takes us. When we get there, we all show up. So until the next drop, stay loud, stay collective, and stay in it. This is ISVi, signing off.